learning lots and learning from other gardeners. Always, everyone has a different technique, a different way of doing things, and you listen to other people and say, I'm going to give that a try. And you may try it and say, yeah, no, that doesn't work for me. And the other thing I want to mention, and I know that in the presentation, someone's going to talk further on this, but it's journaling. Having, it doesn't matter what it is, it could be on the computer, it could be some old notebook, it could be whatever, but writing stuff down. And I'm a prime example of, do what I say, don't always do what I do, because sometimes I forget. And a good example of why it's important to journal is, number one, is having a description or a little drawing of your garden plan and what you're planting where, because you're going to say, oh, next year I'll remember where I planted the peas, and I'll remember where the beans were planted and where the carrots, because crop rotation is very important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so 1 year goes by, and I had planted my garlic the following fall. And then I plant my peas really early, usually the end of March. I haven't got them in yet, but they will be going in this week. And I thought, I'm going to plant them over on this one little area because the peas were on the other side. And I planted them directly on the garlic. And if I had written it down and made a little plan or a little diagram that this is where the garlic is, it wouldn't have been an issue, but I didn't. And I forgot where the garlic was planted. So the garlic and the peas actually grew quite well together, but it was like, what's coming up through my peas? And I went, oh yeah, it's the garlic. So it's a good idea to write things down, because you don't remember where everything is from 1 year to the next. But again, if somebody gives you advice and you try it, you didn't like it, write that down and say, well, I'm not going to do that again next year, because chance I might forget. And then you do it again and say, why did I do that again? Because it didn't work the first time. Why am I doing it a second time? So that's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. So we're going to be talking about planting the garden. And a lot of people plant their gardens different ways. But and some of this information might be a repeat. Before you plant your garden, you've got to make sure that your garden is in shape. And advice that I give to any group that I'm teaching about gardening is, if you're new at gardening, or maybe you're not new at gardening, but still keep your garden a manageable size. Now, when I say keep your garden small, that's relative, like mine's really quite tiny, but whatever is manageable for you. It's easy, and I've seen it happen so many times. You're looking through the seed catalog and you want one of everything, or two or three of everything, and you've got the land to put it on, and then you get all these plants going, and before you know it, it's more work than you can manage. So then it becomes a weed mess, and none of the plants are growing to their potential because you can't keep up with it. So it's best to start small. If you are just starting, add a few containers here and there, have a few little plants in the ground, and then build as you know what your capabilities are. Because there's nothing more disappointing than having this great big garden with this full of ideas, and then have it all come crashing down. Chances are you won't do it again. You'll say, I'm not doing this. It's way too much work. Or if you start small and build, then it is more manageable for you. Consider growing in pots and raised beds. Growing in pots or raised containers or whatever, it's a little more work because you're having to water more often. That water it evaporates a little more quickly when it's above ground. And you have to be a little more strategic on what you're planting in those containers. You're not, depending on the size of the container, of course, you're not going to put really big growing plants like indeterminate tomatoes that are wild and crazy in a relatively small pot. So usually with containers, it's your Thumbelina carrots, or depending how deep it is, you can certainly do your other carrots as well, the deeper growing, but radishes, beets, your lettuce, your arugula, a lot of your leafy vegetables in containers or smaller containers. But be realistic on the time that you can spare on that garden, and choose vegetables that you're going to eat. Again, looking through the seed catalogs, there's, Weird and Wonderful, and I like to experiment with various vegetables, but I'll eat anything. So I'm great, but you don't want to grow a lot of vegetables. Eggplant is a good example, and no one in your house likes eggplant. So what's the point? So you want to grow plants that people are in fact going to eat. It's nice to have one or two that you're unfamiliar with and then search different recipes to try it, and it then might become your new favorite. But as a rule, plant what you're going to eat, and don't plant so much of one thing that you've got more coming on than you know what to do with. Yes, you can share it with your neighbors, and that's a fabulous idea, and you can give some to the food bank. Fresh vegetables are always welcome. But as a rule, try to, and I'll talk about that succession planting, so you're not, feast and famine, where you all of a sudden have 3 bushels of tomatoes and you don't know what to do with them. Plant them so that you're getting tomatoes throughout the season rather all at one time. And if you're just starting out, start with just maybe 5 easy vegetables. And what would they be? Any of your leafy vegetables are pretty easy. Radishes are great. Tomatoes are pretty easy as well. And beans are easy. And those are ones that you sort of want to start with. When I say beans are easy, as long as you don't have a rabbit in your garden. But those are pretty easy and a pretty surefire vegetables to start with. So the first thing, and this might be a repeat from your previous presentations, but your garden is only going to be as good as your soil. So you make sure that your soil is in good condition. And how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to put a lot of compost in, even if you have to buy that compost, maybe a good triple mix. You want well-rotted manure if you can get it. Do not do fresh manure in the spring. You always put fresh manure in the fall, and then it's curing throughout the winter so that you can plant in the spring. Because if you did it now, you'd be burning all of your plants. So you want well-rotted manure with lots of straw. It's going to improve the condition of your soil. And then you're going to till in whatever you are adding to it, or maybe you're doing the no-till, where you're not turning your soil over at all, other than the row that you're about to plant. Read up more on no-till gardening. I'm not going to get into it. I do a whole presentation on that. But also keep in mind that crop rotation. You do not, or should not, plant the tomatoes in the same place as you did the year before. You should never plant your potatoes in the same place as you did before. Your leafy vegetables, not a big deal. Carrots, 1 year you might plant them in the same place 1 or 2 years and it's going to be fine. The 3rd year you might have maggots or something affecting them. So it's a very good idea, as I say in your journal, you have a diagram of where everything was planted, and then you switch them around so that nothing is being planted in the same spot from year to year. That is very important. Farmers, number 1, they will always do a crop rotation, because some plants will deplete the soil, like corn is going to deplete any nitrogen out of the soil. So the following year, they're putting soybeans, and that is replenishing the soil with nitrogen. You could never plant corn twice in a year or twice in a row on the same spot unless you're throwing the nitrogen at it. And again, it's not good practice for the soil or for the plants. So keep that in mind, that crop rotation. I know in a small garden, sometimes it's tough, but keep in mind that you're switching the location of those different plants. Also know that there's different types uh, not types, but your vegetables, some can tolerate the cold temperatures. So you can actually, if your soil is ready, plant out things this month, early this month of April. Things like peas, your lettuce, your cabbage, arugula, kale, those sorts of things you can get in the garden now. And yeah, they might take a while to germinate, but they will. And they love the cold. They love the cold. And if you think you're going to have frost or we're getting really cold temperatures, you can always put, if they're not up yet, you just put a blanket over them or a little hoop of some sort or turned up vinegar, empty vinegar bottles or that kind of thing, just to protect them a little bit. But they love the cool. These are the vegetables, and spinach is another one, that if they are growing in the heat of the summer, they'll bolt, or meaning that they'll stretch and then go into flower, and then they're no longer usable. So they're at their best early in the season and late in the season. And then you have your warm season crops that you don't put in until after May 24th, when the weather is pretty predictable. And of course, peppers do not tolerate the cold. Cucumbers do not tolerate, melons, tomatoes, eggplants. Tomatoes are one that people are always pushing the envelope. You can get the different couches that you can put around them that have water in them that sort of buffer them against cold weather, so that you've got a leg up on the season. Again, it depends how far you want to take it, but usually you're planting your tomatoes again after May 24th. Your light for your garden. Vegetable gardens, as a rule, are going to need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight throughout the day. Ideally, that sunlight should be continuous, but sometimes you might get 4 or 5 hours in the morning and then maybe 4 or 5 hours in the afternoon, depending on what trees or shade or fencing or whatever you have. Your leafy vegetables, your arugula, your lettuce, your kale, that kind of thing, can tolerate shade. In fact, they prefer it a little bit more. When I say shade, I don't mean dark shade, I mean less than sunny. So they'll do okay. In fact, I put row covers over mine because again, I find if it's too hot or too much sun, they bolt. They go to flower very, very quickly, especially my arugula. Not the arugula, I'm sorry, the cilantro. Cilantro is very hard to keep it from not bolting very, very quickly. And your spinach too will bolt quickly in the heat. So keeping that under a cover, and I'll show you pictures of that later on in my garden. So the sun moves across the garden, of course, from east to west. You want to make sure that your taller plants, your tomatoes, your maybe peppers or your pole beans, are not shading the shorter vegetables. So kind of plan that out in your garden. Usually they're up on the north side of the garden, so the sun is going across and those shorter vegetables won't be shaded by that. So planting, pretty basic, we think. Well, when you're ready to plant, again, if you till your garden, that's fine. You till it so it's nice, light, and fluffy. Make sure that you have an area in your garden that you walk. Maybe you're putting stepping stones down in that garden, and then you're gardening on either side of those stepping stones. You want as little foot traffic where you're planting because the compaction is a real issue. So you have an area that you're walking and then you can reach over to wherever you're planting. That is very important. In my little garden, I have to make sure because the compaction can be a real issue. So where you plan to plant, let's say we've got, looks like either melons or cucumbers or whatever it is here, but you then work up that row, or maybe it's an area, maybe you're not doing rows, but you're working that up with a little hand tool so it's really light and fluffy. Then what I do is I take a brick and I just lightly pack that soil down. If it's the row, I pack the row. If it's an area, I'll pack the area. Again, not heavy, but just light so that my seeding bed is flat and fairly tight. So then I will take maybe the edge of the hoe or whatever and make a drill for my row. I'll broadcast, and I'll talk about broadcasting. But then you're planting your seeds. On the seed pack, it is going to give you information on how big these plants are going to get. They might tell you how far to put those seeds apart. But a rule of thumb is that you plant it at a depth that's equal to 2 to 3 times its width. And again, I don't expect anyone to go out there with a measuring tape and measure their seed and then measure the depth of the drill, but it gives you an idea that you plant it a little bit deeper than you would with a smaller seed, of course. So you're going to place those seeds. I know that some people will sort of crunch their package up and sort of tap it, and then the seeds come out a little bit willy-nilly, and sometimes they're a little bit too close. Not a big issue at this point, but ideally you should be placing those seeds, the bigger ones. The smaller ones, you're not doing this, but the bigger ones, so that they're spaced as they should be, maybe 1 inch apart, maybe 2 inches apart, maybe 3 inches apart, depending on their mature size. So once you've got them spaced, you then cover over the soil. And then I take my brick and I hit the top of the soil so that there's good soil contact with the seed. And then at that point, I'm going to water it in well and mark my row. Again, you're not going to remember. You're not going to plant your garden and then say, oh, I'll remember where the beans were and where the peas were and where the squash was. Mark it at that point. If you got your journal with you, it's a good idea to jot down the day you planted, the date, maybe what the weather was like, what your variety was, and any other pertinent information. You know, maybe it was chilly that day, maybe it was a warm day, whatever. Because then you can go back later on and say, you know, my crop was a total failure.